Please note this video is only possible due to the excellent journalists that chronicled the news throughout the year. Thank you to game developers Justin Carter, Chris Kerr, Bryant Francis, Alessandro Filari, Danielle Riendo, and GamesIndustry.biz's Sophie McAvoy, Jeffrey Rousseau, Brandon Sinclair, James Batchelor, Marie Delisandre, as well as any other members who touched these sites in the past year. Links to every article I may or may not be referencing are linked in the Google spreadsheet included in the description. In a very tumultuous year for the video game industry, 2023 started off with some bleed-in from the year prior. Square Enix's president Yosuke Matsuda announced his further resolve to integrate NFTs and the blockchain into future games, having completely missed that fad had already ended in late 2022. Another dangling thread resolved well, with the QA staff at ZeniMax unanimously voting to form a union. Not only is this one of the first US-based video game unions, it's the very first under Microsoft. And since Microsoft was trying to look as pristine as possible to get the Activision Blizzard King acquisition passed through, they voluntarily recognized the union. It was the first big win in a year full of many losses. January 4th and 6th brought news of another growing trend in the games industry: acquisitions. First, Gearbox purchased the 3D capture company Captured Dimensions, then NetEase brought in Skybox Labs. But the 11th is where the pattern of 2023 began in earnest. On the 11th, Ubisoft announced they were in trouble. They cancelled 3 unannounced games, and were quoted as saying, "The company is facing major challenges as the industry continues to shift towards mega brands and long-lasting titles that can reach players across the globe, across platforms, and business models," end quote. This quote, it seems, would be the true forecast for the next year. On the 13th, it was announced that Blizzard and NetEase's partnership would end, apparently due to faulty communication, and result in Blizzard mobile games no longer appearing in the Chinese market. With only 10 NetEase employees remaining on staff, all others were terminated or forced to transfer. 4 days later, Unity announced their plan to lay off 284 employees. Their last round of layoffs was in June 2022. The next day, Microsoft announced their intention to lay off 10,000 employees, including workers from Bethesda Game Studios and many from 343 Industries. Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella described this event as a hard choice. He made $45.5 million in 2023. Then the day after, Riot announced it would be laying off 46 employees, and later that day it came out that many people across GameSpot and Giant Bomb, who had recently been acquired by Fandom, lost their jobs too. These individuals had to announce their unemployment on Twitter. Fandom did not have a press release the day of. The next day, Google announced it would be laying off 12,000 employees, and Vox Media announced it would be laying off 130. 5 days later, Washington Post announced it would completely end its video game coverage by closing Launcher and laying off all roles associated with it. With this, and the publication layoffs and closures throughout 2022 and the past month, video game coverage and journalism was in a dire state. Closing out the month, Proletariat, a development studio working under Blizzard, had been attempting to unionize throughout 2022, but on the 24th they withdrew their election, with Communication Workers of America representatives claiming it was due to strong union busting from the company's leadership. On the 25th, Squatch Games' CEO and Rick and Morty star Justin Roiland was forced to resign after being charged with felony domestic violence. While he was later cleared of these charges, he remains no longer a part of the studio, or of Rick and Morty for that matter. And on the 27th, 15% of Ubisoft Paris went on strike after CEO Yves Guillemot made comments insinuating the recent losses were due to employees not working hard enough. Guillemot did apologize prior to the strike, and it's unclear whether or not the strike achieved a substantial goal, but hopefully it left a strong impression. In February, layoffs occurred towards the beginning and towards the end. On the 2nd, the Korean developer NCSoft laid off 20% of its staff, and the CEO of almost 2 years, Jeff Anderson, stepped down. On the 28th, EA laid off about 300 QA workers from their Baton Rouge office. Nobody was notified ahead of time, and while the staff were offered 60 days of severance, contractors may not have received the same offer. The rest of the month wasn't all bad. Both Nintendo and Sega announced their Japanese employees would be receiving pay raises. Nintendo by 10%, Sega by a whopping 30%. The Finnish studio Fingersoft made the decision to allow their employees to alter their schedules. While they did not opt for the 4-day work week many others are pushing for, Fingersoft is allowing employees to work 6-hour days instead of the normal 8. Albeit this does come with a 10% pay cut, but more flexibility in the workplace is always a good thing. Blizzard disabled Twitter integration from World of Warcraft due to the genius of Mr. Musk. Supernova Capital acquired 2 game development studios, Claus and Little Red Dog Games. Thunderful acquired the German studio Fizbin, and Luminous Productions, developers behind the somewhat maligned Forspoken, were formally merged into Square Enix, losing much of the autonomy the studio had previously. It wasn't all peachy, however. After being live for only 6 months, Epic Games shut down Iron Galaxy's latest battle royale game, Rumbleverse. Unit 2 Games shut down its collaborative game creation platform Crata due to Stadia's closure early in the year. Activision Blizzard was hit with a $35 million settlement for having mishandled workplace misconduct complaints. Days later, they announced the end of full remote work, requiring employees to travel to an office at least 3 days a week. Smilegate announced Crossfire X would shut down in May, just over a year after its initial release, and Rovio took the original Angry Birds off the app stores to get customers to play their microtransaction-laden live Angry Bird titles instead. And in some scary news, riding the then new wave of machine learning / large language models masquerading as artificial intelligence, it was reported that many companies are pressuring voice actors to hand over the rights to their voices to AI companies. A terrifying trend in the industry, so desperate to make money doing anything, including stealing the voices from voice actors, in an attempt to save a buck. Lastly, as a bit of foreshadowing, the Embracer Group announced they currently had 11,152 employees working on 224 projects throughout its many embraced development studios. Nothing could possibly have ruined this. March opened with a response to Activision Blizzard's return to the office policy in the form of Activision Blizzard having allegedly terminated 2 employees who attempted to speak out against the mandate. The next day, Sonic the Hedgehog's dad, Yuji Naka, admitted to insider trading during his tenure at Square Enix. He was arrested back in November 2022, and on March 2nd, the lead developer of Balan Wonderworld confessed to buying stocks with the knowledge of the then unannounced and short-lived Final Fantasy mobile game FF7: The First Soldier. Then, on March 7th, Take-Two, the company that owns Rockstar and 2K Games, laid off members from its third publishing label, Private Division. An exact number is unknown, but the Take-Two spokesperson said it affected mainly corporate operations and their publishing label. Strauss Zelnick and President Scarl Sladoff were paid a combination of $72.3 million in 2023. 2 days later, Gameloft, who has mainly worked on Disney games like Dreamlight Valley, announced they'd be closing their Budapest office. While this announcement didn't come with any layoffs, it's presumed those unable to relocate would be unable to continue with the company. The same day, Discord announced it was making its service worse by integrating OpenAI as a chatbot and a server moderator. And then on the 14th, Happy Pi Day, Meta, the company formerly known as Facebook, announced their plan to lay off 10,000 more jobs. This is coming only months after Meta laid off 13% of their workforce, 11,000 jobs, the past November. CEO Mark Zuckerberg renamed the company in an effort to capitalize on the concept of the metaverse. This has not gone well for the company, resulting in the quote-unquote necessary downsizing from November 2022 and March 2023. Zuckerberg made $2.28 million in 2022. On the 15th, Maximum Entertainment acquired Fun Labs, the long-running Romanian studio, and on the 20th, Arctic 7 acquired Star Fort Games, the 4-year-old Canadian game development company, and Narwhal Studios, a visual art production company. Also on the 20th, even more layoffs. Amazon announced it would be cutting over 9,000 positions, reference not intended, 400 of which were a part of Twitch. Amazon CEO Andy Jassy made the initial statement, and made $1.3 million in 2022. Twitch announced its layoffs were due to a lack of growth because every company needs to grow exponentially forever. On the 21st, Ubisoft announced its new technology to help push out early-level writing positions that would make games worse as a whole, the AI Ghostwriter tool. Ubisoft claims it would only be for character barks, or when they say a generic line to respond to an action in-game, and that writers would still be there to manicure the tool's output, but this still marks the start of a very dangerous trend in the development world. This next one is weird. On the 22nd, Nexon announced MapleStory Universe would utilize NFTs in 2023? Wild, absurd even. About a week later, on the 28th, Take-Two, who, again, laid off employees just 3 weeks prior, announced acquisition of the mobile game subscription service Game Club. I guess they had money for that. And the next day was another rough one. Disney let go of 7,000 employees, including its entire metaverse division. Much like Meta, Disney had made a bet on the mythical concept of the metaverse. This bet did not pay off, and the 50 workers in that field paid the price. Bob Iger was set to earn up to $27 million in 2023. And the next day, again, EA laid off 6%, around 800 of its employees. This is despite EA announcing $7 billion in net revenue from 2022 to 2023. CEO Andrew Wilson made $20.7 million in 2023. Finally, in some good news turned foreshadowing, on the 16th, Bandcamp's entire staff was able to unionize under Epic Games. And then just plain old foreshadowing, on March 31st, after every major publisher pulled out, the ESA finally cancelled E3 for 2023. After publishing their first 2 titles, the mega indie publisher Devolver Digital acquired Doinksoft on the 3rd of April. Apparently this is the 5th studio Devolver has gobbled up. Not sure if that makes any of these devs still independent, but hopefully they'll still have the leeway to make fun and creative experiences. Speaking of acquisitions, 2 days later, the Saudi government, or rather the Saudi government-owned gaming firm Savvy Games Group, has purchased the mobile developers Scopely for $4.9 billion. So maybe avoid any Scopely games if that's where your politics lie. God, that's so much money. You know who else has so much money? Amazon, who the next day laid off about 100 more people, this time those working in its video game divisions. On the 11th, Justin Carter reported how AI-generated images were already taking jobs away from game artists in China. Even companies as large as Tencent and NetEase were opting to save a quick buck by resorting to the image theft generators. Truly disheartening. I need some good news. How about this? On April 12th, Koji Kondo's theme for the original Super Mario Bros. Was inducted into the National Recording Registry by the United States Congress, and it's the very first video game song to receive this honor. Kondo's one of the best out there, happy that he's received due recognition. Well, back to the grind, mobile developer InnoGames laid off 75 staff members on the 14th, having previously employed over 400 people. That's a rough cut. And speaking of Nintendo, just to remind us that they are in fact a corporation, Nintendo won a court order against D-Storage. D-Storage made the simple mistake of continuing to host OneFitchier, a pirating website. This cost D-Storage €442,750, in addition to Nintendo's €25,000 in legal fees. 2 days later, in yet another baffling move, Square Enix once again doubled down on their declaration to embrace the blockchain by partnering with the Web3 company Elixir Games. The Web3 obsession always was, and continues to be, incredibly confusing to me, plus it wastes so much energy. On the 19th, Epic Games continued its Fortnite-backed forever growth, this time by purchasing the mobile developer Aquaris, and rebranding it as Epic Games Brazil. Oh right, and it looks like they'll be getting right to work making expansions to Fortnite, this time aimed at the Latin American market. Also on the 19th, the first game-centric meta layoffs struck. The VR developers Downpour Interactive and Ready at Dawn both lost many good people in Zuckerberg's restructuring. Anyway, Atari owns Bubsy now, as well as a bunch of other classic game franchises. That's wild. Focus Entertainment purchased Dovetail Games, who largely work in the simulation genre, and Sony purchased Firewalk Studios, a studio that has yet to put out a game, but is currently working on a multiplayer game led by Bungie Studio alums. Big day for corporate conglomeration. The next day, once again due to Elon Musk's genius, Microsoft removed Twitter sharing capabilities from all Xboxes. Remember when Blizzard did that with WoW not too far back? Lol. In finally some good news, 144 employees at Sega's North American offices have formed a union. Good job to all involved. I sure hope Sega doesn't do any nasty union busing later on in the year. And on that same day, Epic Games lost their lawsuit against Apple. I sure hope this lengthy and expensive lawsuit doesn't cause Epic to do their own restructuring down the line. I wouldn't normally bring this type of story, but I did want to mention that on the 25th, the 2022 formed Cosmic Lounge gained 4 million euros in funding to create an AI mobile game. This specific company is unique in that they are using AI to prototype game mechanics, in addition to art and writing, cutting even more developers out of the picture. Finally, on the 28th, I received some news I found personally upsetting. The good folks at Waypoint Vice learned they'd be losing their jobs by June 2nd. Thank goodness this actually has a happy ending. They were able to transition their subscribers, myself included, into their own ownership, and I've had an incredibly successful launch of Remap Radio. Still, the video game media and journalism landscape continues down a death spiral, but at least these few were able to land on their feet. May didn't start out great. On the 1st, Phoenix Labs, the Vancouver studio behind Dauntless, laid off 30 employees. This restructuring was apparently due to Phoenix Labs buying itself back from its former owner, Garena, back in February, and needing to cut back on current projects. That same day, Astrogen Entertainment, which itself is owned by Team 17, purchased the German studio Independent Arts. The purchase makes sense, both Astrogen and Independent focus on simulation games, but it's a bit unfortunate that after operating since the 90s, Independent Art is no longer independent. The second brought a continuation of Japanese developers giving their employees pay raises. Joining Sega and Nintendo, Xenoblade developer Monolith Soft increased a new graduate starting pay by 22%, with existing employees also to receive increases. It's nice seeing these few developers bucking the trend and actually respecting their employees. Truly saddening, almost every company is opting for mass layoffs. Speaking of, months after laying off 300 workers, Unity laid off an additional 600. That same day, another company announced that it would be integrating large language models into its service. This time, the popular tool Game Maker announced AI integration as part of its 2023 roadmap. And on the 5th, it was reported that Riot, a studio under Activision Blizzard, was to pay a $100 million settlement to over 1,500 current and former employees. The settlement agreement was made back in July of 2022, but the fact that 1,548 women were affected is truly staggering. Also on the 5th, while representatives said it wouldn't result in too many lost jobs, PlayOn, the company formerly known as Koch Media, restructured its publishing arms, Deep Silver, Matter, and Ravenscourt, under the single PlayOn banner. 3 days later, Sony announced it would be completely shuttering Pixel Opus in June. The Concrete Genie developer was among the last under Sony that made weird and interesting games, and while I am part of the problem, having not touched Concrete Genie, it's a shame seeing this bastion of creativity gutted. Then, 2 days later, Ubisoft let go of about 60 workers in their customer service departments across both North Carolina and Newcastle, with no notice either, which is particularly deplorable. The next day, the Dublin-based game studio Keywords acquired the Seattle-based Hardsuit Labs, a support studio that had previously worked on a number of Call of Duty games and Fortnite. After weeks of layoffs and more conglomeration, Steam finally delivered some uplifting news on the 12th, when they updated their code of conduct to explicitly ban gambling. So many people are susceptible to gambling addictions, and it is truly welcoming to see the biggest PC marketplace making a stand to protect its users. Hey, remember when Atari bought all those retro properties a while back? Well, on the 15th, they bought Night Dive Studios for $19.5 million. Night Dive being the group that developed the System Shock remake. Yet another strange purchase by this group that utilizes the same name as the classic development studio. That same day, Deviation Games laid off up to 90 employees. While Deviation hadn't shipped any game, they had partnered with Sony in 2021 to develop a new franchise. What that game would be is unknown, but it could potentially be one of the multiple live service games Sony has in development. This is also coming only a few months after Deviation co-founder Jason Blundell left the company in September 2022. Also on the 15th, CD Projekt Red laid off 29 of the 43 members of the Molasses Flood. They too were working on a multiplayer title. The 19th brought layoffs from the indie studio and publisher Brace Yourself Games. The Crypt of the Necro Dancer developers lost about 50% of their co-workers. That same day, the Life is Strange True Colors developers Deck 9 Games laid off 30 developers. On the 23rd, Sega laid off 121 developers from Relic Entertainment, leaving just under 200 employees still with the company. This is coming only months after their Japanese studios received a pay raise, and shortly after the first Sega union was formed, albeit under a different branch. The same day, Blizzard announced its own proprietary image generator, Blizzard Diffusion. Their pitch is that it would build upon existing Blizzard games to help create concept art. They also stated the goal of letting it write more responsive NPCs. Of course, ask any artist and they'll tell you they don't need a computer program to recycle old art, and ask any writer and they'll tell you that AI can't write interesting dialogue, but what do they know? They'll be laid off soon enough. But the next day, May 24th, marks the downfall of one of the worst companies out there, the Embracer Group, which for years had been purchasing up as many studios and game properties they could get their grubby little hands on, failed. A potential partnership that would have gained the company $2 billion fell through. In August, it was reported that this deal would have been with the Saudi Arabia government's Savvy Games Group. The CEO nearly cried in an interview shortly after this news broke, and so many developers paid the price throughout the rest of the year. CEO Lars Windegers is still with the company. On the 25th, the mobile studio Kabam, who had recently worked on a couple Disney games, laid off a whopping 12% of its workforce, and the next day, Antimatter Games announced it would be fully shuttering over the summer. Their parent company, Enad Global 7, considered selling them or restructuring the company, instead opting to close it completely and let go of the 52 people associated. The last day of the month, the 31st, brought 2 studio layoffs. Vanpool, the studio that helped develop multiple Kirby games, completely closed down, and Firaxis of XCOM fame, who most recently developed the largely panned but critically adored Midnight Suns, laid off some number of employees. This is also after the former director and studio head Jake Solomon and Steve Martin left the studio in February. There were a lot of layoffs in May, so many lives affected. To end it off on a somewhat light note, on May 19th, all Bandcamp employees were able to form a union under Epic Games, and it's a real good thing they did that. June opened as one might expect. CD Projekt Red laid off the entire Gwent team. While some were transferred to other teams, 30 members lost their livelihoods. On the 2nd, EA let go of 2/3 of the staff at Fire Monkeys, declaring the studio a mono-title studio, and would only be allowed to work on supporting the live services for The Sims Freeplay. All other titles in development were cancelled. And that same day, Blaseball shut its doors. The only game Friends at the Table ever sponsored was apparently deemed unsustainable by the game band's leadership. The game ended, the studio shut down, many employees were let go. On the 7th, another game journalist and critic layoff, with Inverse cutting 25% of its staff across its entertainment, gaming, and science sites. The next day, the Sega Union Aegis announced it believed Sega was attempting to interfere with their unionization efforts. The same day, it was discovered and reported that Cyan World's latest games, Firmament, had used AI-generated content. This content was used for features that were directly funded by Kickstarter backers, and in their response, Cyan Worlds did not apologize to the backers, only noting that AI generators were in a gray area for many. The 13th brought the first big ramification of the Embracer failure. At this point, CEO Wingefers only teased that in an effort to become a more focused, self-sufficient company, there would be layoffs and there would be game cancellations. The next day, the 23-year-old Danish studio Kilu Games laid off its entire staff before closing completely. That same day, EA put out a comical list of business risks. One such stated that unionization efforts could materially impact our business, another citing that regulations on AI could do the same. bashing unions and announcing their intention to adopt AI crap in one foul move. On the 21st, Scavengers Studios laid off the majority of its staff. Of the at least 45 employees, only 16 remained. This was apparently due to their most recent title, Season, not selling well enough and forcing leadership to downsize. Regardless of reasoning, it's still a painful cut. Almost a week later, on the 27th, Hi-Rez, the developers behind Smite, let go of 10% of their workforce across its various divisions. That same day, another game engine announced its integration with large language models. Unity announced Muse, a tool to create assets and animations, and Centis, a way to integrate neural networks into games. They also announced an AI marketplace where more art theft tools can be purchased. A couple days later, Niantic announced it would be closing down its LA studio and laying off 230 employees. They were yet another company that saw a rise in profits due to COVID, hired too many people, then got scared when the COVID boom declined. Lots of foresight in these companies, it seems. Hey, remember when Unity announced their art theft store? A day after opening it, they already had to remove one of these tools, called Atlas, because, get this, it violated the terms and conditions. Who'd have thought that the art theft tool would have stolen art? Who could have guessed? That day at least brought some good AI news. It was reported that Valve would not publish any games that featured AI-generated content since the developer does not have all the necessary rights. Unfortunately, in 2024, Valve walked back on this. Finally, the month closed out with news from Daedalic Entertainment. Earlier, they released the Golem game, a title that probably should have been left on the cutting room floor. As expected, the title was rough. Unfortunately, this did write the end of all internal development by the studio. 25 members were let go, their next game was cancelled, and the studio would focus solely on publishing titles from other developers. July brought yet another update on the Embracer Group. While a little short of the $2 billion they were hoping for, the company was able to raise $182 million to help buffer themselves a bit. It didn't do much. The next day it became official. Yuji Naka, who had previously admitted to insider trading, was found guilty. He was handed a suspended sentence and fined $1.1 million, where as long as he remained clean for the next 4 years, he wouldn't have to spend 2.5 years in prison. On the 10th, Sega announced Line Next would be developing a blockchain title with an immensely popular franchise, so that sucks. What doesn't suck is, on the same day, the Sega of America Union successfully voted to unionize. Despite pressure from Sega, a 91-26 majority vote made it one of the biggest game unions in the US, with Aegis noting it was the biggest multi-department union in games. Hopefully, Sega doesn't do anything bad later in the year. Riding this high, the next day, Splash Damage adopted the 4-day workweek. The London studio that most recently worked on Transformers Reactivate didn't even add any caveats. All employees retained their full salary. Congrats to everyone there. Well, that's enough good news. Microsoft laid off 276 more employees after letting go of around 10,000 in January. On the 13th, it came out that Formosa, the voice acting studio that handles the English VO for Genshin Impact, wasn't paying its actors. Two of them, Karina Boker and Brandon Winkler, noted they hadn't been paid in half a year. Hoyoverse said they'd put pressure on Formosa to pay the actors. That same day, Lightspeed Studios announced it acquired Lucid Games, the studio behind Destruction All-Stars. Lucid would apparently stay independent. For how long? Who's to say? It was reported that the FTC would be launching an investigation into ChatGPT and its relation to harming consumers. The FTC's angle is that it makes false, misleading, disparaging, or harmful claims about people, which is a touch away from the massive plagiarism I would hope they'd be looking into, but hey, hopefully something good comes from it regardless. Anyway, Google's now letting NFTs onto the Play Store. Why? Who can say? Money laundering is my guess. On the 24th, Tencent became the majority shareholder of Techland, the developers behind Dying Light. A few days later, they also fully acquired Visual Arts, a Japanese publisher known for releasing visual novels. Back on the 26th, Capcom acquired Sword Canes, a support studio that had most recently helped work on the art and animations for Hi-Fi Rush, Final Fantasy XVI, and Street Fighter VI. And CD Projekt Red had its third layoff of the year. this time letting go of 100 of its core dev team workers on The Witcher and Cyberpunk. But in this case, the layoffs would occur throughout the first quarter of 2024, not all at once like their other two. August 2nd brought, you guessed it, more layoffs. 32 employees were let go from Striking Distance Studios, the developers behind the Callisto Protocol. That same day, Kickstarter announced that, while it would still allow projects to utilize AI-generating technologies, they would require the project to be marked as doing so. Hopefully, if the projects follow the rules, people will know not to back those, but it also sounds incredibly easy to get around. On the 4th, GameStop finally announced it would be ending its crypto wallet in November, because who even wanted it in the first place? On the 7th, Unity announced they would be creating Weta Tools, which was pitched as specializing in 2D and 3D art production, which I mention only for the foreshadowing. Embracer's first official closure came the same day as they shut down Campfire Cabal and laid off the entire staff. On the 9th, Acid Wizard Studio announced that after making one final update on their recent game Darkwood, they would be going on an indefinite hiatus, with only a possible return in 5 to 10 years, as well as encouraging other developers who would want to start developing sequels to their existing titles to reach out to them. The next day, the company that rose from Telltale's ashes, also calling itself Telltale, acquired Flavorworks, a development studio focused on mobile narrative games who most recently released the game Erica. Also on the 10th, Blizzard released Overwatch 2 onto Steam, the very first of their games to be released off of Battle.net. It was also review bombed, but that's slightly less important. It's more notable about the death of publisher-owned marketplaces. The day after that, Rockstar announced it purchased CFX.re. For those unfamiliar, GTA Online has a very large role-playing community, the largest of which were created by CFX.re. Theoretically, Rockstar would be integrating them into whatever online experience will come with GTA 6. On the 16th, NCSoft announced Varco Large Language Models, attempting to push even more artists out of work. And in truly saddening news, Microsoft announced on the 17th that the Xbox 360 marketplace will be shutting down in July 2024, following the trend set by Nintendo's Wii, 3DS, and Wii U stores, as well as Sony's PS3 and PS Vita stores no longer accepting credit cards. Many games will be lost. Also on the 17th, it was revealed that Hi-Rez Studios had a clause in their voice actors' contractors that gave the studio permission to clone the actor's voice using AI. This clause was apparently being obfuscated away, hidden behind NDAs, preventing actors from speaking out. The studio CEO, Stuart Chisholm, denied these claims, but the next day Hi-Rez updated its AI policy. The old had exceptions where if the actor was dead or incapacitated, the studio could recreate their likeness. These exceptions were removed. The next day, Sega finalized its purchase of the mobile developer powerhouse Rovio for €706 million. The Embracer Group also published their financial results for the first quarter of the year, which claimed the net sales rose 47%. Of course, this increase wasn't enough to stop the bleed. The 21st brought truly shocking, bitter, saddening news. Charles Martinet is no longer the voice of Super Mario. He would still be employed by Nintendo under the role of Mario Ambassador, which I guess means he'll still go to conventions. Mario's new voice actor, Kevin Afghani, wasn't found out until October, shortly before Mario Bros. Wonder released. Back on the acquisition playfield, the next day, Behavior Interactive purchased the Netherlands porting powerhouse Code Glue and renamed it to Behavior Rotterdam. On the 23rd, about 50 employees were laid off from BioWare. They were also unable to create a new contract with the playtesting services company Keywords, which may have been due to Keywords having recently unionized. That same day, it was also reported that the remake of the game Broken Sword utilized AI for a few hundred sprites, with lead designer Charles Cecil stating the game would not exist without it, that hiring animators would be too costly. Sony also announced the PlayStation Portal, a streaming device that lets you stream the PS5 to the screen. A weird thing for sure, but honestly, if I had better internet, I could be convinced. The next day, Sony began the process to purchase Audiz, so that it could expand its audio technology for PlayStation games. Have you heard of Star Citizen? This game has promised users the world, nay, the universe. A bunch of A-list actors, a cool ship economy, cool space action that you've been wanting. They announced this project in 2012 and since then have continued to raise money from funders. On the 25th, they were only $5,000 away from having raised $600 million in funding total. But I mean, it has been in development for over a decade. But still, that's a lot of money. People really seem to want this one. Nobody I know, but someone sure does. And this is the beginning of a very rough patch. On the 28th, Imaginary Studios, who at this point has not released a single game, already laid off a majority of its staff. Although this is just when it became official, it was seemingly in the works since July. The next day it was announced Me Games would be shutting down. The studio most recently released Shadow Gambit: The Cursed Crew. The studio heads at least publicly stated they would help their employees find other opportunities during this wind-down period. That same day, Ronimo Games, the studio behind Awesomenauts, filed for bankruptcy. The studio lead said they were in a good spot development-wise, just not monetarily, it would seem. The next day, Blackbird Interactive, the developers behind Minecraft Legends, laid off 41 members, and many future projects were cancelled. On the 31st, Embracer hit again, this time fully shutting down Volition, the studio behind Saints Row, and laid off many employees from Gearbox Publishing. That same day, Black Eye Games shut down and ended the service of its MMO Gloria Victis. September news opened on the 4th with Epic's Tim Sweeney stating that the Epic Game Store would be open to AI. Great. The next day, Humble Games Publishing announced it may be doing the opposite, where developers must state their games don't use AI to generate assets. Then on the 6th, VentureBeat laid off some number of its employees. On the 7th, Atari made another acquisition, this time the website Atari Age. They claim the website will be run the same as it was before. It was also reported that Jagex, the developers of my beloved time waster RuneScape, or RuneScape Classic in my case, might be getting sold for the 6th time in the past decade. The next day, Bungie won a court case against a single human being. This person was caught repeatedly cheating in Destiny 2. Admittedly, the person did it way too many times, but I don't think they should have been fined $500,000 for it. That's life-ruining money, and we're talking about a video game. In Embracer has really lost it news. On the 11th, it was reported they were considering selling off their probably most successful studio, Gearbox. Embracer only embraced the Borderlands studio 2 years prior, and is currently optioning it off or considering making it independent. That same day, Ubisoft Montreal workers were forced to return to the office despite being promised in years past that work from home would be a permanent solution. In contrast to this, on the 18th, Sony Insomniac's Brian Intahir brought up how work from home continues to work great for the studio, with no return to office in sight. And in a year full of big ones, one of the biggest was Unity's new fees. The game engine announced it would be charging developers a runtime fee based on how many installs the software would get. This fee would likely have been to get some extra money from free-to-play titles like Genshin Impact. It would also bankrupt many indie developers. After raucous anger among developers, Unity began to clarify. First, they clarified the game had to earn enough money first, then they said deleting and reinstalling the game would not count towards the fee, then they mentioned downloads through services like Game Pass would be liable to Microsoft, not the developer. The next day they continued trying to put out this fire by saying it had its own proprietary model for determining downloads, and that developers would be charged monthly. 4 days later, a full week after the initial announcement, Unity announced they would be changing the runtime fee. This was announced on the 22nd, along with an apology to the angry developers. Personal developers would not be affected, and they would still be considered personal if they continued to earn less than $200,000 in revenue. The runtime fee would also only take effect in the next version of Unity that would arrive in 2024. For Pro and Enterprise users, the fee itself would be the lowest of either a 2.5% revenue share or a calculated fee based off of the self-reported numbers of new users. Additionally, no game making under $1 million within the past 12-month time span would be required to pay. This new plan seemed to quell the anger in most devs, but some are still set on moving on to other engines like Godot or Unreal. This includes a group known as the Boston Unity Group, which had operated for 13 years. The group disbanded due to the eroded trust in Unity's leadership. Enough about Unity for now. Back on the 14th, Ubisoft shut down its London studio, affecting 54 employees. The next day, Ascendant Studios, the studios behind Immortals of Avium, let go of about 45% of its workforce. That same day, Playtika bought the mobile game developer InPlay Labs. Much like Cosmic Lounge back in April, a new studio, Series AI, was able to raise $7.9 million in funding to create an AI game engine. There's so much money to go around, but only for theft tech, not for the actual workers and artists. Back to Embracer, they cut 26 positions from Bream Dog, who had recently worked on Mythforce, and cut some number of positions at Crystal Dynamics, the Tomb Raider and Marvel's Avengers developers. The Embracer-owned Saber Interactive also ended support for Evil Dead the game. Afterwards, Embracer CEO Wingefers confirmed more studios would be either sold or closed in the near future. On the 21st, Striking Distance founder Glenn Schofield left the company, this being only a couple months after the company laid off 32 employees. On the 24th, Roblox announced it would cut 30 members from its recruitment team, and the next day, longtime Sony employee, Sony Interactive president since 2019, Jim Ryan announced he would be retiring. His last day was September 30th. That same day, Sony also announced that it was investigating a ransomware attack. The group apparently stole 6,000 files ranging from Java to HTML. Also on the 27th, Blizzard laid off 10 developers from the Hearthstone team, some having been with the company for many years, one having been there for 18. On the 28th, Sega cancelled Creative Assembly's almost finished multiplayer shooter Hyenas, among a few other unannounced titles. Hyena had been demoed multiple times, with its most recent PC beta taking place less than 2 weeks prior. This cancellation also resulted in layoffs within the team. That same day, Epic laid off around 900 employees. CEO Tim Sweeney stated that the company had been spending more than it earned, while also blaming the player creation content within Fortnite. Apparently needing to share revenue with the player creators meant less revenue for Epic. I also recall a couple very expensive lawsuits that Sweeney didn't mention. Some employees laid off included many from the Fall Guys studio Mediatonic. This also brought news that Epic would be selling off Bandcamp to Song Trader, spelled wrong, only 18 months after buying them in the first place. Bandcamp is one of the last great sites on the internet, especially for musicians, and it's a shame what Epic did to it. During this, Ubisoft made their own layoffs, letting go of 6 members from its community and social media teams. Finally, on the 29th, SAG-AFTRA was unable to make a deal with the 10 video game companies it was negotiating with. The deadline was extended, but earlier in the month, members voted to authorize a strike if necessary. October started out with more unfortunate news. On the 2nd, Hatoful Boyfriend's original creator Hato Moa claimed she had not been paid any royalties on the game since Epic purchased Mediatonic in 2021. That's not good. The same day, Team 17's CEO Michael Pattinson left the company and around 50 employees were made redundant. This is coming less than a month after they reported their revenue was up by 31%. The next day, Puny Human, the developers behind Galicide, announced its closing shop. CEO Mike Sanders blamed a third party that did not follow through on agreed-upon payments, but took full responsibility for the closure. Regardless, everyone will be losing their jobs. That same day, Naughty Dog let go of at least 25 contractor jobs. Finally, on the 3rd, Dang, the studio behind the truly excellent Boomerang X, also shut down. It, too, lacked the funding to continue. On the 4th, Nintendo announced that the 3DS and Wii U would end their online functionalities by the end of April 2024. The stores already closed down in March, but any purchased titles will still be downloadable after the online cutoff date. The 5th brought news of another Sony breach. That's right, a second one, this time having affected nearly 6,800 current and former employees. Keywords, the studio that couldn't renew their contract with BioWare in August, went through their own layoffs on the 5th. This contract failure resulted in 13 more developers losing their jobs. The 5th had one more layoff story, this time reporting that Telltale had laid off most staff working on The Wolf Among Us 2 back in early September. On the 6th, Virtua Studios shut down its subsidiary Calypti, only a year after it was founded. Finally, some good news. The Swedish developers behind Just Cause and Contraband, Avalanche Studios, are unionizing, and luckily, Sweden already has good labor laws. Hopefully the transition is as smooth as it can be. And the same day, workers under CD Projekt and other Polish studios have joined the Polish Game Dev Workers Union. On the 9th, Unity leadership decided on their scapegoat for the recent runtime fee debacle. John Riccitiello stepped down as CEO. Riccitiello is in no way a good person, but he also wasn't the sole driving force behind Unity's bad decisions. I'm not sad that he's gone, but I still do not trust Unity leadership. On the 10th, Sony unveiled their first major revision for the PS5, the Slim model. The disc model also comes with a detachable disc drive, bringing us ever closer to the all-digital future, a future I am personally dreading, but I have no real say. Just over a week after the first wave of layoffs, Team 17 announced the restructuring would affect closer to 1/3 of the workforce, up to 91 positions. Longtime CEO Debbie Bestwick also announced she would be stepping down, in addition to digital CEO Pattinson having left at the beginning of October. The next day, on the 12th, Paradox Interactive announced that it had let go of 80% of Harebrained schemes in July. Harebrained most recently worked on Lamplighters League. That same day, the Fragbite Group announced it would be acquiring the indie studio Fall Damage, who is currently working on the shooter Alera Prime. In AI news that's much more gray than the other stories have been, on the 13th, it was reported that CD Projekt Red used AI to emulate the voice of an actor who had passed for their Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty expansion. In this case, CDPR had an actor read the lines, then used the AI to make the voice sound like the former actor Milogost Rexek. Rexek's family also gave express permission. This is much more similar to how, say, Disney has handled Darth Vader or Luke Skywalker in the latest TV shows. I can't say how the performance in the game turned out, but I do know the Star Wars performances don't sound good, but maybe grafting it onto an actor's voice works better. In the end, all three cases got explicit permission from the actors they're emulating, whereas most AI models only steal. Even so, who can say the AI they used wasn't built off of stolen performances either? I can't throw my full support at this, but at least CDPR tried, more than most others, to make it right. And that wasn't the biggest news on the 13th. After almost 2 years, Microsoft finally completed its $69 billion acquisition of Activision Blizzard King. To appease the various worldwide governments, Microsoft made multiple concessions. They promised Steam, Nintendo, and Sony to bring Call of Duty to the competitor platforms for the next decade. They promised to put their PC games on Nvidia's streaming service, and to appeal to the UK's CMA, they struck a deal with Ubisoft, who will control Activision Blizzard cloud gaming rights for the next 15 years. The US FTC also attempted to block this merger but failed in court. Even for me, who is strongly anti-megacorporation conglomeration, can see the good in this merger. Activision had become incredibly rigid in recent years, only seemingly able to chug out the yearly Call of Duty, and the leadership from serial abuser Bobby Kotick was less than ideal. And it seems like Microsoft has already given many studios back their autonomy, but it also means that the largest third-party developer is no longer. All those developers are now owned by one of the big three console owners. Not that Activision was doing much anyway, but still. Regardless, the companies are now merged. On the 16th, it was revealed that during Epic's layoffs from September, they let go of almost half of the current Bandcamp staff. Thank goodness they unionized. That allowed them to negotiate proper severance. That same day, Side acquired the audio service studio Vibe Avenue and rebranded it as Side Montreal. It had previously worked with Marvel, Sega, and Disney. And yet another studio raised millions of dollars to build an AI game. This time, Jam and T Studios raised $3.15 million to make a multiplayer RPG. And finally, on the 16th, the mobile studio Metacore Games purchased the animation studio Piñata. The next day, the studio Thought Pennies, who had yet to release a game, laid off several employees. The studio behind F1 manager Frontier also laid off a number of employees. The next day, Zen Studios of Pinball FX fame laid off 32 employees. And Roblox ended work from home. On the 20th, about 50% of 6-2-Start were laid off by the parent company Olive X. 6-2-Start made it big with Zombies Run and most recently worked on Marvel Move. On the 23rd, Sony laid off multiple employees from the support studio Visual Arts. As a breath of fresh air, developers at Xperis, a support studio that works on Forza Motorsport, have begun the process of unionization. And then on the 24th, Roblox laid off 15 of their Chinese employees. Sony's Media Molecule of Little Big Planet and Dreams fame let go of around 20 employees. Embracer let go of 35 Digic employees on the 26th. Digic being an animation studio that had recently worked on cinematics for Assassin's Creed Mirage and Lords of the Fallen. Also on the 26th, and after 2 years, Microsoft began reorganizing ZeniMax leadership into the Xbox leadership team. It was also reported that Meta's Reality Labs lost $11.4 billion during the first 3 quarters of 2023. I don't see the metaverse taking off. It seems like more layoffs will be likely. Good job, Zuckerberg. On the 29th, Motorsport Games, who developed NASCAR Rivals, also laid off around 38 jobs. While mainly based in Miami, most of the layoffs occurred in the UK and Australia. On the 30th, Sony's Bungie laid off multiple employees. This was apparently to keep revenue up. There was a contractual obligation to meet certain financial goals, and if not met, Sony would take full control of the company. As such, leadership kept profits up by laying off employees. They responded to the question of, why not take pay cuts with, Bungie is not that kind of company. Sony will eventually gain full control of Bungie, and many employees will pay the price of their bad management. The Biden administration made its first big swing against AI. Biden signed an executive order requiring companies to create safety and security standards, share safety test results, create a guidance for AI watermarking, for evaluating privacy techniques, and demanding a report on how AI would affect the labor market, which all sounds good to me, and hopefully won't overlook that these are just plagiarism machines. Speaking of AI, Embark Studio admit that they used AI voices in the finals and stood by their decision. The finals released with these still in the game. And October wrapped up with Atari acquiring yet another studio, this time the excellent restoration and preservation studio Digital Eclipse. Digital Eclipse had recently put out the Atari 50 collection, as well as the making of Karateka. And all I can hope for is that they are able to continue putting out excellent retrospectives under this new leadership. I'll also note I was laid off at the end of October too, although I didn't work in games. On the 1st of November, Devolver Digital acquired yet another indie dev, the Astroneer developers System Era. They spent $40 million on the acquisition. The next day, Sony Interactive Entertainment began the purchase of the AI video company iSize. This is seemingly aligned with a goal to improve the cloud streaming of games. The next day, Embracer laid off many workers from their subsidiary, Cryptic Studios. They had recently worked on Neverwinter. On the 6th, 100 Thieves cut 20% of their workforce, which primarily affected their game development studio and their energy drink Juvie. This is also how I learned 100 Thieves makes games and had an energy drink. I'm still not sure what else they do. Not to make light of the livelihoods lost, I just know nothing about them, despite being familiar with the name. It was also announced that the German-based Phoenix Games was to acquire the Canadian developer Sad Panda, who most recently worked on Crush Crush. PlayStation joined Microsoft in removing Twitter integration from both the PS4 and PS5, good job Musk, and the Embracer Group's COO, Egil Strunke, left the company swearing to build his own Strunke Games. Hopefully he learned a lesson and won't buy up a ton of companies he can't afford. On the 7th, Ubisoft Montreal laid off 98 people, noting that the total will be 124 by the end of its restructuring. It was also announced that, due to the co-founder Scott Benson's health issues, the Glory Society would be shutting down and its upcoming title Revenant Hill was to be cancelled. The Glory Society consisted of staff who worked on Night in the Woods, a game special to many. All I wish is for the good health for all of those involved. Aftermath, a worker-owned independent cultural website, also launched on the 7th with former Kotaku staffers Gita Jackson, Nathan Grayson, Riley McLeod, and Luke Plunkett. They're all good writers, and I can't wait until I can afford to support them directly. Speaking of former employees starting their own website, Second Wind also launched, formed by former The Escapist employees, most notably Yahtzee Croshaw. This is also less than a day after many of them resigned from The Escapist. On the 8th, it was reported that Embracer was considering shutting down Free Radical, who was developing the new Time Splitters game. The 9th had Digital Extremes of Warframe fame laying off over 30 employees and ending operations on any external projects. Geo Media was also hit by layoffs, with 23 roles made redundant, including the complete shuttering of the women's cultural site Jezebel, and at least some layoffs at Kotaku. Sony also announced that many of its planned live service games have been delayed. Sony purchased Bungie for their live service expertise, and it seems making one is a difficult endeavor. Someone at Ubisoft is still into the mythical concept of Web 3 and started a collaboration with Immutable to create a blockchain game for some reason. Valve also announced its first major iteration on the Steam Deck with the Steam Deck OLED. On the 10th, interim Unity CEO Jim Whitehurst said future layoffs would be likely, despite revenue increasing 69% year over year. After 9 games and a decade of operation, Samurai Punk closed shop, seemingly due to owners wanting to try something new. Sega teamed up with Equez, an AI startup company specializing in creating voxel monsters. On the 13th, Amazon let go of 180 employees across its various gaming branches. The next day, Digital Bros cut 30% of workers from its subsidiary, 505 Games. They had recently released Ghost Runner 2 and Crime Boss Rockade City. Following Sega's pay raises from early in the year, Atlus raised its own employees' annual salaries by 15%, and on the 15th, Humble Games announced it would be laying off some number of employees, who they described as valued colleagues. The next day, Embracer confirmed it laid off 900 people over the past 3 months, despite a net sales increase of 13%. In bad news come to roost, Sega of America was accused of union busting by letting go of 40% of its unionized staff and offshoring the positions elsewhere in Europe and Japan. Annapurna, the mega indie publisher, acquired the South Africa-based 24-bit Games, who most recently supported development on Cocoon and Neon White. Unity announced Unity 6 would be launching in 2024, and would include AI tech in addition to other updates. On the 21st, after reports that Twitter was a little too racist and anti-Semitic for comfort, Ubisoft joined the many other companies who pulled advertising from the site. On the 27th, Togi Production acquired Mojiken Studio. Togi had helped Mojiken publish their most recent game, A Space for the Unbound. It was also reported that ReedPop, the group that organizes the PAX conventions, was interested in selling off its game publications Eurogamer, GameIndustry.biz, and Rock Paper Shotgun, among others. The next day, Embracer laid off 50 Fish Lab employees who had recently worked on Chorus. It was also confirmed that Embracer would be fully shutting down Free Radical Design by Christmas. On the 29th, Unity announced it would be cutting 265 jobs and ended its agreement with Weta months after announcing Weta Tools. It was also reported that some people within Sega had begun using ChatGPT. What it's being used for is unknown, but they stand committed to the technology. At this point, NPR reported that roughly 6,500 video game workers lost their jobs within the past 11 months. A truly staggering number. An unconscionable number. Grotesque. December opened with good news, as Xbox support dev Express successfully voted to unionize, but by the 4th, the 6,500 number became obsolete, as Phoenix Labs laid off 34 developers across its support teams. They had recently worked on Dauntless and Faefarm. The next day, EA laid off developers from its EA Sports WRC developer Codemasters. TinyBuild confirmed they would be cutting jobs, and the developer of Insurgency, New World Interactive, also went through layoffs. On the 6th, the Communication Workers of America gave a set of principles designed to help unions bargain against the oncoming wave of AI. They don't want to kill AI adoption, just do their best to protect the artists threatened by it. The now Sega-owned Rovio also closed down its Montreal studio, Studio Lumi. 16 employees were affected. League of Geeks also let go of over 50% of its employees and paused development on their upcoming game Jumplight Odyssey. This was notable for multiple reasons. The Australian devs were fighting against rising cost of living, the weakening Australian dollar, and having funding unexpectedly pulled. There's money for new AI startups, but none for proven indie devs. It wasn't all bad though, as CD Projekt voluntarily recognized the Polish Game Dev Workers Union that was announced a couple months prior. On the 7th, Triple Topping declared bankruptcy. CEO Astrid Refstrup said they were proud of the studio's work on games like Inglet and Welcome to Elk, and blamed themselves for the closure. All employees lost their jobs. In a surprising good move from Microsoft, potentially to stay in the good graces after their latest acquisition, after being pressured, Microsoft welcomed 77 contract workers into the ZeniMax union, 23 of which were offered full-time positions. They all recently received pay raises and the protection that comes with their solidarity. Also, they all got a copy of Starfield since they worked on it. Probably should have sent that to them regardless, but hey, progress is progress. A couple days later, the ZeniMax Union was also able to strike a deal with Microsoft, giving them the deciding power behind the usage of large language models. Also, the Game Awards happened. I can't talk about the Game Awards anymore. So I hadn't heard about this game at all until after the fallout. Apparently Fantastic spelled without the first A, whose most recent game was Prop Night, was about to put out a new game the day before. They pitched it as an open-world zombie survival MMO, which was too difficult a task for the studio. When the game launched, it was a terribly buggy zombie extraction shooter. It sold well, people got upset, many refunded, the game was pulled from Steam, Steam offered refunds to anyone, and 4 days after launching, Fantastic shut down. There's a lot to take away from this, but in the end, it's developers paying the price for bad management yet again. Also on the 10th, the Tender Claws Human Union, along with the CWA, were able to strike a new deal with Tender Claws. The union was voluntarily recognized back in 2022, and after months of debate, the contract was finalized. Good job, everyone. The 11th made it official, E3 is dead. After canceling 2023's E3 earlier in the year, the ESA finally announced that they would not be trying again, that the industry had moved on, that E3 was over. And then Epic actually won a court case. While their case against Apple didn't pan out, the jury ruled in favor of Epic in its Google case. This ruling deemed the Google Play Marketplace an illegal monopoly. The judge will later state what this means for Google, but presumably they'll have to allow more stores to become easily accessible. Also, Epic's Tim Sweeney continued to be weird about it on Twitter. It was also revealed that Sony was dealing with its third major security breach. This time, Insomniac Games was hacked. The hackers obtained game files from Spider-Man 2 and the upcoming Wolverine game, but more importantly, doxed many past and current employees. I-9 forms, passports, archived Slack conversations were among the confidential documents leaked, and that is despicable. I hope all those affected are able to get through this. On the 14th, Naughty Dog announced it would be canceling its previously announced live service multiplayer The Last of Us spin-off. This was the right decision. Live service games are hard to run and even harder to become successful. Hasbro announced its intentions to lay off 1,100 employees throughout 2024. Embracer laid off developers at both 3D Realms and Slipgate. The next day, GameFund Astra let go of multiple employees. On the 18th, Tencent closed Team Kaiju. Their unannounced title canceled. Some employees transferred, the rest let go. All of this being right before the holiday break. Vile. Keywords acquired the Multiplayer Group, a subsidiary of Improbably, to bolster their own live service games portfolio. Keywords went through layoffs just a few months earlier, and Activision Blizzard settled a lawsuit with the California Civil Rights Department. The CCRD claimed Activision Blizzard fostered a culture of sexual harassment and paid out $45.75 million to those employed between 2015 and 2020. Activision Blizzard also noted the end of its hybrid work policy, forcing all employees to return to the office full-time at the start of January. On the 20th, it was announced that Activision Blizzard CEO Bobby Kotick's last day would be on December 29th, which is unusually quick for an acquisition. Microsoft really wanted that guy out. A lot of people did, really. But don't worry, he had a golden parachute. I can't believe this is a story. On the 21st, the Epic Games Store reversed their ban on adult-only games. As long as the games utilized blockchain technology, which is just wild. On the 22nd, an 18-year-old kid's life was ruined by Rockstar Games. This kid did hack the company after hacking Nvidia previously, and was set on continuing to hack companies in the future, but for his crime of stealing unreleased videos, he's been sentenced to an indefinite hospital order. Another 17-year-old kid is currently on trial for the Nvidia hack. Hopefully they don't ruin his life too. And to end off 2023 with a bang, Versus Evil, the developers behind the Banner Saga, and First Contact, the developers behind Firewall, both fully shut down. 2023 was a terrible year for video games. Thousands of people lost their jobs. All the while, greedy executives continued to fund large language models in an attempt to replace even more. It's not that there was no money to be thrown around. There were acquisitions aplenty, and while I didn't mention most of them, there were plenty of new studios receiving plenty of funding themselves. But this funding was only going to existing names, people who came from Blizzard or EA or Activision. Indie studios were not given the same confidence, even when they had proven track records. And even with all of the new studios, that isn't enough to cover the sheer amount of losses that 2023 had. The first couple of weeks of 2024 have not been better. There have already been over 2,000 layoffs, and large language models continue to be pushed. What can we do? I guess we should support those who need it. Subscribe to Remap, Aftermath, Second Wind, any who are doing independent journalism that you like. Vocally support the devs who make great games, and suppress those who wish to sling hate at them. And developers, forming a union is the best way to gain protections, higher wages, and a good severance if need be. Anyway, so long. Goodbye.